Well, hello, everyone. I'm very happy to start off the second day of our conference. Yesterday, we encountered challenges that arise from human-animal connections, such as violence, conflict, and domination. Today, we will explore opportunities and means to minimize conflicts and to reduce the multi-species relations, to redefine, the multi-species relations in the world we live in. I'm delighted to begin this day with a keynote talk that resonates today's theme, titled Dimensions of Humane Communities, Perspectives on the Intersection of Human and Non-Human Animal Well-Being, by Professor Philip Tedeschi from the University of Denver. Philip is a dear friend and colleague of our program at Tel Aviv University. He is the founding executive director of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection and a clinical professor at the Graduate School for Social Work at Denver University. Professor Tedeschi studies the intricate relationship between people, domestic, and wild animals, and the natural world. His research explores the therapeutic potential of human-animal nature interaction, trauma-informed methods of human-animal connection, social and ecological justice, and intervention into violence towards people and animals. In his most profound view, a critical part of our quality of life depends on having healthy relationships, including our relationships with non-human animals that constitute an important form of social support. The talk will be followed by a short discussion. I invite anyone who has questions or comments to write them in the chat box, and we will return to them in the discussion. Philip? To you, Philip.
Thank you, Anat, for that warm welcome. And it's nice to see everybody. You know, you're getting the real thing when I have a dog that lives under. You know that I have a dog living under my desks at the moment, so you know that I'm connected to animals even as we speak. So I'm going to be speaking to you today about some of the work that I've been working with a large team of colleagues and student researchers here at the University of Denver. I am a professor in the Graduate School of Social Work, and we are really quite a unique center in many ways. Almost all of the human-animal bond academic centers in the United States have emanated out of veterinary programs, and ours is distinct in that we're looking at the issue of human and animal relationships through the lens of the social sciences. So I'll be telling you a bit about these concepts and work. I also want to just thank the conference organizers and my awesome colleagues. Nat, thank you for the invitation here, and Nan as well. They have taught me a lot about the work that they're doing there, and it's really an exciting time at Tel Aviv University. I see my other colleagues, Jonathan and Neva and Gabby. Thank you for joining us today. It's so good to see you as well. All right, I'm going to try to get going here. So let me get set up. All right. Annette, you're seeing that okay? Great. All right. And Annette, if you would do me the favor of, if there are questions that come up as we go, let me know and we'll stop and answer those questions.
My pleasure.
Okay. So the first place I'd like to start is just telling you a little bit about my institute. Are you seeing a new slide now? Let's see here. I just want to make sure that it's
yes.
forward.
Yeah, it looks
properly.
Good.
It's forwarding, okay. All right, so our institute's focuses in three primary areas. We look at the therapeutic or human-animal benefits to our connection with animals. We also look at issues related to animals and communities. We're also looking at a concept that we sometimes call conservation social work, or One Health. All of these, we believe, are different dimensions and important areas of the work that we do, and I'll be giving you examples of each of them. The primary relationships that we have at the University of Denver that have allowed for this integration of new ideas and what we sometimes refer to as consilience, or the integration of knowledge across disciplines, has been our relationship between the School of Social Work, called the Graduate School of Social Work, the Graduate School of Professional Psychology, and our law school, in particular, our animal law program. Our vision for doing this work largely emanates out of this idea that these collaborations allow us to examine the issues of our relationships with animals through these distinct lenses. In particular, you'll hear me referring to this concept of social science-informed approaches to animal law and social policy. We have built a rigorous research agenda, and I'll be talking to you a bit about some of the research areas that we're focused on. In particular, one of the areas that we've become very interested in is the connection between animals and human beings in relation to social justice issues for both humans and non-human animals. So where this began was a few years ago. We began writing about the concept of a university playing a significant role in beginning a conversation, really a larger narrative about the importance of universities being centers for humane education. We began to develop this concept together through the lens of numerous projects, including a project that we call the Colorado Link Project. In fact, I just presented in a Knott's class about last week on this focus on the connection between people and animals in relation to interpersonal violence. But we've also been looking at other related issues, including the intersection of animals and the law, and also looking at how it relates to community health. So this has emanated in, or resulted in the development of what we sometimes now refer to as social ecological justice, and a broader framework for looking at animal protection considerations and human protection considerations as highly connected. And I think what we'll find is that the deeper we explore this, the more connections we find. But I would like to show you some of the ways that we believe these might inform the development of both our communities, policies, and a wide array of issues that can improve the lives of both people and animals together. So the way we define this is we define a humane community as the presence of leaders and institutions and policies working collaboratively across social and political systems to create and implement sustainable human, animal, and environmental welfare considerations. So we started to study this concept of whether these are in fact measurable metrics, whether we can actually demonstrate that by improving the welfare of any one of these areas, that we can improve the welfare of others. So the concept of humane communities has started to define a whole array of research projects. We think of it as kind of a suite or portfolio of research projects, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of those. So the first is that we're using social action research orientation to begin to inform this process. And we're focusing in these three areas that I mentioned earlier: animals and communities, the therapeutic human-animal interaction, or we might think of that as the health-promoting benefits of our connection with animals, and then a One Health informed or conservation social work framework. We are serving as the research arm for the Humane Society of the United States and a number of other organizations in demonstrating some of these principles. One of the areas that we've been looking at is animal protection issues. In Colorado, one of the issues that came up earlier this year was the removal of geese from parks, for example. So we started to examine how animals and wildlife were interacting and began a process that allowed us to examine the use of these parks and the benefits of having wildlife present in these parks. We've also been studying the issue of needing to realign animal protection work to be focused on less of a punishment-oriented approach and more of a support-oriented approach. Ironically, the human animal protection field, to a large degree, has hang on one second here, sorry. The animal protection field, to a large degree, has established a reputation for, at least here in the United States, for utilizing fairly harsh approaches to responding to animal cruelty, rather than approaching this through the lens of more human support and support services orientation. So let's just talk a little bit about an example of that. The Pets for Life One Health study has focused on humane communities by basically looking at these communities as individuals and as communities that need services, resources, information related to pet keeping, and that the goal of these studies has been to determine whether by providing intensive animal welfare programming resources translates to community level benefits. So we've been working in about 5 different cities across North America, and what we've been able to demonstrate is that by providing good animal care, we're also able to change the human metrics of health and well-being in these particular communities. Published in the Journal of Urban Affairs earlier this year, we published an article called Humane Communities: Social Change Through Policies Promoting Collective Welfare. And what we really were beginning to uncover was that one of the primary causes for animal welfare risk factors were issues related to oppression and discrimination in those communities, including racially discriminative practices, things like redlining that actually impacted communities' capacity for resilience. So these would be things like income inequality, wealth disparities, other forms of racial and economic segregation were prominent in the related issues that were impacting not only human welfare but also animal welfare. Housing is a primary reason for a number of the animal welfare risk factors that we were seeing in these communities, as is access to things like education, uneven or unfair enforcement. This really is connected to the broader conversation of over-policing of communities of color, and things like incarceration and other criminal justice-related inequality are primary drivers of animal welfare considerations in many of these urban environments that we were studying. So what we began to recognize was that these were highly connected, that the social justice issues affecting vulnerable communities or communities of color in particular in the United States were in many cases at risk, not only relative to human health, but that these were also areas that we were seeing a significant level of animal protection considerations occurring simultaneously. So one of the ways that we can support animal welfare is by trying to keep people and animals together. Now this, in the United States, for example, we might see this in any number of lenses. We're working with an organization called My Dog Is My Home, which started in LA's Skid Row, and we began to study the presence of animals in the lives of persons experiencing homelessness. In about 25% of persons experiencing homelessness, we'll find animals living with those individuals. So when we start to work for a housing first model with recognition that keeping animals and people together is a critical dimension of persons utilizing these services, we were much more successful at both protecting the animal welfare considerations, but also supporting the health and well-being of those individuals as well. So one of the social science frameworks is a concept that we refer to as social capital. And social capital can be defined in a number of different ways, but largely is referencing this idea of connectedness, the actual ways in which, or the dimensions or dynamics that allow communities to stay connected to one another. Turns out that our relationship with companion animals is a fantastic way to support social capital and supports primary mental health issues that we're concerned about as social workers. As a social worker, we always start a mental health evaluation by determining whether somebody has support systems. And as we've started to study this, what we have found is that animals can serve as social support, much like a human being can. In fact, we see largely the same health benefits occurring with persons who are living with animals as they might living with another individual, another human individual. So these are quite important, at least here in the United States. Isolation and loneliness has turned into probably the single most dangerous mental health condition, and it's comparable to other really very dangerous conditions, things like chronic smoking or obesity. Isolation and loneliness are extremely challenging issues to treat, and it turns out that animals can play a primary role in the management of these issues. These are what we then call acceptance or radical acceptance or the concept of protective factors. For those of us who live with animals, it seems almost, obvious that this is the case. But for many of our leaders in our communities, other politicians, persons establishing policies affecting housing-related issues, transportation-related issues, those sorts of things, it's not always recognized that animals play such a significant role in social support. So when we look at this through a risk and resilience standpoint, and risk can be defined, and in the social sciences, we define risk as factors that are likely to predict poor outcomes. And resilience or protective factors are those factors that tend to predict good outcomes for individuals. Turns out that when we support ways in which we can allow persons to maintain their relationship with their companion animals, that we see these serving as very powerful protective factors that allow individuals to flourish. We've also studied, by the way, the well-being of animals for persons living in these circumstances. And what we find is that the animals, in fact, are also generally flourishing, especially when there's access to low-cost veterinary care or free veterinary care and other resources necessary to support the human-animal connection. This has resulted in us beginning a development of a set of new research tools. We refer to this particular concept as social, environmental, economic impact assessments, or what we sometimes acronym as SEIA. And SEIA is used to look at the economic benefits of the development of compassion or compassion centers. So this is an example of one study that we did in Oklahoma City that looked at the idea of, instead of building shelters, city shelters that are somehow placed out of sight and out of mind, in many cities around the United States, for example, shelters are built on the edge of town or in factory districts or in places that persons wouldn't encounter them. So we started to examine the idea of a center built right in the middle of a city where it became one of the more prominent ways in which the city promoted the human-animal connection. And what we found, and routinely in these particular studies, we've done this in numerous cities, by the way, is that these become economic drivers. People actually congregate in these areas, start to spend more time, start to actually engage. And this is where we start to see this concept of social capital being incentivized, as well as economic drivers for those communities. So we believe that as we start to articulate these various dimensions of the benefits of animals in our lives, we will start to see policymakers look at at alternatives, or maybe even revisiting the importance of policies that support human-animal connection. Another policy that plays out in the same way is the concept of co-sheltering. And co-sheltering is a term that we use in numerous contexts, but we're especially seeing this right now in the presence of an increased number of high impact natural disasters. This is a picture of Hurricane Katrina's impact on the basin of New Orleans, where the city filled with water, and many people lost their lives as a result of being unwilling to leave their homes during these disasters. This resulted in the Pet Evacuation and Transport Standards Act of 2006, and since then has been continually implemented in responses to natural disasters. So now, for example, our federal emergency management organization is required to respond to natural disasters with the capacity to remove animals alongside people as a result. We also see co-sheltering, however, important in other concepts. I've already mentioned briefly the role that animals play in the lives of persons experiencing homelessness or other forms of housing insecurity. But we also want to recognize co-sheltering is relevant in domestic violence and family violence situations and other reasons why people might be displaced. For example, conflict zones, wars would be another possibility. And when we fail to recognize the human-animal bond, we're going to see our services less likely to be successfully implemented as social scientists. So we're wanting to really recognize that co-sheltering is an important strategy for many of these other approaches to working with supporting people in crisis. More recently, a lot of my own work has focused on the role of the human-animal connection in human health. In particular, I've been interested in the neurobiology of the human-animal bond, and a year ago published a book called Transforming Trauma that looks at how our relationship with animals changes the human brain. And and probably those of you who have animals in your lives already know this. I've watched Neva with her cat, so I know that this happens routinely in Jonathan Neva's home. But when you're interacting with a companion animal, just as an example, you're likely to be more friendly, more talkative, more optimistic, more social in general. In fact, what this research suggests is that when we see our interaction with safe animals occurring, we see an activation of the neurotransmitter or the what we sometimes refer to as the oxytocin system that literally changes the way our brains function. And this becomes a fairly significant tool for working with individuals who don't easily trust or who have been harmed by other people. Now, as a social worker, I routinely work with persons who don't who as a feature of their own history have been harmed by others and don't easily trust. So by incorporating an animal into into our work with those individuals, often we're able to establish a therapeutic relationship and beachhead. We might even suggest that interacting with an animal present allows us to be more likely to be able to build friendships, which is why, for example, when you're out in a community and somebody has a dog with them, the interactions, the social capital that occurs from these interactions likely creates a very different interaction than somebody would experience just walking by themselves in a community. So pet keeping is a tool for developing relationships with family members, with other neighbors, and improves the entire community's capacity for confidence and trust in one another. So this probably looks familiar to some of my colleagues. I know Gabby would recognize these photographs. We've been doing some research with animals for persons experiencing the challenges related to being incarcerated. We have been doing this work in the United States for quite some time, but with the support and help of our colleagues in Israel, we were able to publish the standard protocol for prison-based training programs. This is now downloadable from the Humane Society of the United States repository as a free document that sets best practices for the development of these programs in prison-based settings. It turns out that by incorporating animals into prisons, we can improve outcomes. So our most recent research, which is focused in the Department of Corrections in Washington State, has demonstrated that we can improve things like recidivism outcomes, numbers of incidents in prisons, and those sorts of things. So there is a program, if you're not aware, that is at Harmon Prison in northern Israel that has been established with the support of our colleagues there. And we're looking forward to continuing to work with the Israeli Prison Service to expand these types of programs. These are really win-win programs in many regards, because not only do they improve the safety of prisons and the outcomes for persons incarcerated, but they also can save animal lives, in part because animals will thrive in circumstances that allow for good nutrition, good care, structure, and then can be adopted out into their permanent homes. We're really interested in this idea of developing empathy in prison environments, and there's lots of different ways to do this. The program in Washington State has a very unique set of programs that include the reintroduction of endangered species into ecosystems around in the Northwest of the United States, in Washington and Oregon. These are all animals that have been placed at times in endangered status, and the prison is involved in raising things like butterflies and frogs. So it really is a very interesting opportunity to change the entire culture of a prison environment. Looking at this through a little bit more of a macro lens, this is a diagram, and I won't spend too much time on this because I know we have limited time, but this is a diagram coming from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the United Nations examination of ecological systems. And I wanted to just share how we think these look, why these are important, and how they look on a more macro level of consideration. One health, or one where, is this perspective that human and animal and ecosystems are connected, and that our resiliency in all of those areas are related to one another. Now, there's different ways to unpackage this or explain it, but I think one of the ways that I like about this particular diagram is that it looks at these issues through ecosystem services, contributions, and then the interrelationship between things like security, basic materials necessary for good life, things, for example, like shelter, or adequate livelihoods, access to clean water, that sort of thing. These improve our health and good relations. And I'm going to talk here in just a moment a little bit more about how this plays out. So ecosystem services are, we've been living through this the last year, that when we see a degradation of ecosystem health, we also see risks towards human beings. In particular, we see the transmission of viruses or diseases that can occur, things like HIV or even Ebola, or for that matter, malaria. And more recently, we've obviously experienced COVID as an example of that. But there are a number of other risk factors that also should place us at risk and should make us interested in these ideas. One of them is the overall degradation of the health of the planet. And we see this through, dramatically through the use of fossil fuels. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about these in relation to other considerations like farmed animals. The use of animals as consumption, in consumptive manners is probably one of the most significant challenges to the planet. So the work being done at Tel Aviv University to examine alternatives, plant-based diets, and are not just simply opinions about how we should eat, but literally our strategies for, rethinking our relationship with the living planet. Animal welfare is placed at risk when we fail to do this. Wildlife trade issues are also a significant issue. Obviously, as I just mentioned, farmed animal use, other forms of animals in captivity, animals that are homeless or abused are risks to communities. Animals that are being harmed in laboratory environments and other forms of mass killing, things like poaching, for example, are also examples. And I'll talk in a moment about why these are so significant. The concept of solastalgia is not familiar to everybody, but it has, as a therapist, I've been a psychotherapist for many years, and I've been interested in this idea in particular in relation to what we call ecoteric disease, the presence of mental health disorders that we believe are closely connected to experiencing or observing harm being done to living systems. Now, in the research that I've been doing in this area, we sometimes refer to this as bioaffiliative safety. So, for example, if you were in the presence of another living being that's being routinely harmed, there are consequences related to that experience that you will encounter. And these would be examples of risk factors. So the presence of animals in our lives is only beneficial when animals are actually flourishing or thriving. When we're in the presence of animals that are being harmed, we actually see risk factors directly associated with this. Glenn Albrecht, who coined the term solastalgia, refers to it as this idea of being homesick even while you're at home. And I like that terminology because I think all of us have probably observed living spaces, or maybe even individuals, non-human animals, or even the human animal that's being harmed, that then impacts us, right? And so these become important concepts to build into questions around our communities and policies. In general, there's a lot of reasons for people who care about animals to be frustrated and really angry, I think, because animals are brutalized routinely every day in communities and countries all over the world. In virtually every society, the laws that are needed to protect animals are insufficient at this point. And we really need a revolution, a real sea change to begin to rethink our relationship with other animals. An area that I've become very concerned about, and this is really current, it has been the radicalization and what we might consider link violence. And not, I know in your class, we didn't really get a chance to talk about this in much detail. But I think this story that literally is only a week old, one of the individuals who was charged with the insurrection on our nation's capital was also arrested for poaching a mountain lion when he was not even supposed to have access to a firearm, for example. So these are connected now in curious and disturbing ways. The gun lobby, the passion of having guns in our communities is highly connected with anti-government belief systems, the killing of wildlife that tend to be protected by the government. So we've seen, for example, the killing and or torturing of wolves that are being reintroduced into communities as this kind of overreaction or bizarre kind of radicalization of kind of being viewed as the introduction of animals as some form of government overreach. And we don't really understand this very well, but what we do know is that these are connected to racialized violence, gun violence, and the killing of animals. And so we're beginning to start to study this. Fortunately, here in Colorado, we have a very supportive political system that has allowed us to begin to look at alternatives to this, and in fact have managed to ban the killing, what they call killing contests here in Colorado. Killing contests are usually where, ironically, the Parks and Wildlife Service, the organization responsible for animal protection, authorizes the mass killing and or contests, what we consider a killing contest, where they'll place, for example, coyotes and create a bounty. Often there's a cash prize related to this. In Colorado, we've been able to ban this, but in numerous other states in the United States, killing contests continue. So these are examples of what I believe are broken policies, broken politics, and probably broken promises, really, to our own communities. Ironically, for example, in Wisconsin, when you pay into a fund dedicated to animal protection, that at times that money is used to do things like fund killing contests, right? So these are examples of laws that have been quite derailed and broken, and I think are examples of the areas that we need to change. So humane education is one of our strategies. I know the work that Gabby has been doing and others is beginning to look at ways that this can be done across Israel. This is a very important concept, all the way from the our best universities all the way down to our grade schools. And that humane education can be built in and has at different times in our US history right into the school curriculum required for children in schools. And I really believe that this is a necessary next step. So lastly, just to wrap up here, I think we should recognize that our lives are closely connected to other animals, and that the way in which we learn to interact with them and protect them and be interested in their lives will ultimately impact our own quality of life. That one element of this is empathy, is the development of empathy, and to confront the areas in our society that are causing or might be results of callousness, which tends to be closely connected to violence towards people and also violence towards animals. So with that, I will wrap up and see if there's any questions. I know that was really a fast conversation, but hopefully gave you a sense of what we're up to here.
Thank you so much, Philip. It was really amazing, and your work is really astonishing. So we'll open the discussion session now. If somebody wants to ask a question, you can use the raise hand button or write something in the chat. Well, maybe I'll start. So Philip, I was thinking about this negotiation between violence and compassion in our world towards animals and in other dimensions. And how do we start to, you were talking about the benefit of animals to the human welfare, and we can see violence towards animals in every form and shape. So my question is, how do we start to negotiate between understanding the sources of violence and taking it towards compassion?
You know, I would welcome any other person's thoughts on that. You know, it's the very question that keeps me up at night. You know, I don't think there is an easy answer. From my perspective, you know, the idea that somehow animal rights is, you know, some kind of radical perspective strikes me as part of the problem. You know, that I think we've normalized negative impacts on the living planet and other animals, and to some degree people, in ways that have numbed us and allowed for a tremendous amount of callousness to be typical, even in younger children, for example, where they have grown up around these issues. And you know, we're at a point where the research suggests that an individual tree in, for example, we've studied this in Chicago, in fact, in the public housing, where an individual tree has value to the outcomes directly related to things like academic performance. You know, so we probably, you know, I don't know the answer of how we create the momentum towards change, but I do think this idea of humane communities, where we start to expect leaders, you know, we start to expect better from our leaders and from our policies and from our laws than we get right now in relation to the protection of the planet. And I think building an evidence basis for this is really what we're trying to do at our institute. And I'm excited about the development of the institute that's emerging at Tel Aviv University, because I believe we'll work together on building this discussion and this narrative. But then we have to build better leaders and better policies. And I think if we do that, we will also get a planet that we would, you know, all prefer to live on and want to raise our children in.
Thank you. And we have Barbara King's question in the chat box. I will read it. I wonder if you could speak to how to scale up One Health type projects so that members of US Congress or members of other governing bodies internationally understand and may make policy based on its principles.
Well, I think that just maybe one example would be, so we have a study going on called Pets for Life as a One Health study. And that particular study is being done on behalf of the Humane Society of the United States, which is the single biggest animal protection organization in the world. You know, that organization has numerous projects all over the United States and also has an international arm to it. You know, as we're starting to demonstrate that by improving the well-being of companion animals, we can also see things like the improvement of health metrics for communities and human health, keeping people and pets together, for example, or providing adequate resources necessary. These are forms of prevention science, and that concept of prevention science is embedded in One Health, that if we can demonstrate that as we improve the metric of one, we're improving the metric of another, for example. So, you know, the primary cause of risks to animals around the world is poverty, is deep poverty. And so if we become interested in issues related to wealth, you know, wealth disparities, equity for other, you know, for vulnerable communities, recognizing that sustainable livelihoods are a critical element to the well-being of human being, but also are the primary reason why we see animals at risk as well. And around the world, if we apply that concept, it's the same sort of thing. Anti-poaching initial research that we're doing in East Africa, for example, the best strategy for reducing illegal animal trade, things like bushmeat trade, is to work on issues related to sustainable livelihoods, right? So these become examples of that One Health framework. So I think what we believe is that maybe the way to scale that up is to demonstrate recognizable, kind of manageable projects. And Pets for Life is an interesting project because they literally go into vulnerable communities that we know, for example, are at risk as a feature of economic issues and have low socioeconomic low socioeconomic capability, and change those metrics and provide resources as an alternative. And so that moves the issue up the river. We don't have to wait in those communities for those to be criminal charges for neglect. We can actually resource those communities earlier by being more engaged and providing better resources in those communities. So these are our examples, I think, of kind of demonstration projects that we believe are, can be presented as reasons to improve policy and hopefully recognized by our leaders as well, our political leaders. I'd welcome anyone else's thoughts on
there's
that.
one hand raised, Shlomit.
Yes, thank you very much, Philip, for a wonderful lecture. I was wondering, here in Israel, we don't have a very popular hunting culture. I don't think that we have a hunting culture at all. But in the States, it's very popular. And I was thinking, how do you work or fight to disconnect gender norms that affiliates masculinity and manhood with hunting? I mean, it's really popular in the States. So what do you do about that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not one that I understand perfectly, but I will tell you that as I've gotten more involved in these issues as it relates to wildlife, I do think that there are persons that we would define as I think some people might debate this idea, but more ethical hunters and less ethical hunters. More recently, we've started to see this connection between kind of unregulated interest in guns and the connection between that and illegal wildlife killing, with very little concern for the laws. In fact, to some degree, would be described as kind of anti-government kind of attitudes. But as you're talking about, there may be a gender-related consideration, although I think here in the United States, we also have many, women who are also brought up in that culture and are hunters as well. So, I don't really know the answer to that, but I think, from my perspective, the opportunities here would be to really have better control over the organizations that control these hunting guidelines. So, in Colorado, just as an example, the most wild animals are actually killed as a feature of our own organization that we pay to protect them. We call it CPD, or Colorado Parks and Wildlife Service. They're in charge of our wildlife, and they're the leading killer of wildlife. So we actually have seen a reduction in interest in hunting by the general public, but then we see the political control of the hunting laws and practices. And as I mentioned, things like the killing contest, even the kind of over reliance on kind of human exceptionalism here is problematic. The idea that we know how to manage wildlife better than the wild itself is quite problematic. We've seen a lot of animals pushed right to the edge of extinction as a feature of human-driven policies, including, I mean, just as an example, things like the killing of prairie dogs here along the Front Range of Colorado. They're a keystone species that support, you know, the black-footed ferret, the all the animals that live in the long grass prairies along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains are at risk when we bulldoze or undermine or poison or kill these other keystone species. So our own wildlife services would be a really great place to start. And if we could get control of those organizations by having persons that were more conservation minded, more One Health minded, better balanced, you know, policies and perspectives, I think we could make a big change. You know, then maybe allowing maybe ethical hunting could be sustainable. I personally, I would like to see that dramatically reduced, but I do think that in general, we could start by having better policies and control over those systems. And our own Parks and Wildlife Service are the most culpable right at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you, Philip. We actually ran out of time, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions to be asked, and I'll be happy to pass them on to Philip later on. So we'll take a 10-minute recess, and then we'll come back with a reconsideration session.